Then, after a pause, he said, "You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of characters in my life, cowboys, soldiers, detectives, and one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story. Good, bad, ugly. It didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to carry it. So tell me this, what's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin stared at Clint, unsure if he was serious. "The next chapter?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," Clint said, leaning back. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So what's the next chapter?" Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival didn't leave much room for long-term planning. I don't know," Kevin admitted finally. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." Clint's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's a sentence. You need a chapter, a real one, something you can build on." Kevin felt an odd mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about struggle, but he held his tongue. There was something about the way Clint spoke, like he wasn't just throwing out cliches, but genuinely wanted Kevin to think. Then, Clint reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Kevin's heart sank. This was the part where the dollar would come out, and Clint would send him on his way. But instead of cash, Clint pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go here," Clint said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's a shelter run by a buddy of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step." Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" Clint's expression softened just a fraction. "Because someone did it for me once, and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't." Kevin wasn't sure if he could believe in second chances, not after everything he'd been through. His fingers hovered over the business card as if it were made of glass, fragile and full of promise. He wasn't sure he deserved it. The name and address printed on it felt like a lifeline, but the weight of his doubts pulled at him. "I don't know, man," Kevin said after a long silence, shaking his head. "I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "People like you? What does that even mean?" Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding eye contact. "You wouldn't get it. Guys like me, we're just forgotten." Clint leaned forward again, his voice quiet but firm. "You think I've never been down?" Kevin looked up, startled. "You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world and no one's there to help you lift it?" Clint's face, though calm, carried the weight of his words. "I grew up dirt poor in the middle of the Depression," Clint continued. "I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow's going to be any better. And let me tell you something, Kevin, it's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you." The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he had nothing to say. Clint leaned back, his tone softening. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this: life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or build you." Kevin felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice cracking. "No, it's not," Clint agreed. "But simple doesn't mean easy. It's hard as hell. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been." Kevin stared at the card again, his mind racing. He thought about the nights he'd spent on cold concrete, the meals he'd scavenged from dumpsters, the faces that turned away from him every day. And now, here was this man, a stranger, a legend, telling him he was worth more than all of that. For the first time in years, Kevin felt a spark of something he couldn't quite name. Hope. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. "I'll think about it," Kevin said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded, as if that was enough. "Good. That's all I'm asking." But Kevin wasn't the only one affected by this encounter. Clint had his own reasons for stepping in, reasons that would soon come to light. Kevin clutched the business card tightly as he stood to leave, unsure of what to say or how to feel. Clint's words echoed in his mind, stirring up memories he'd buried long ago, of better days, of dreams that once felt achievable. As he took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back. "Thanks for listening," he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Kevin," he said simply, before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Kevin didn't see Clint's hand falter slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Clint's jaw tightened for a brief moment, as if holding back a flood of emotion. Sitting alone again, Clint let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Kevin had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been reminded of his past, but it hit harder this time. He'd been younger than Kevin when he first learned how quickly life could knock you down. Growing up during the Great Depression, Clint had watched his parents struggle to keep food on the table. There were nights when all they had was a can of beans to share between them. And then there were the strangers, neighbors, church folk, sometimes complete nobodies, who had stepped in with small acts of kindness that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic who'd offered Clint his first job, a chance to earn a few bucks cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something invaluable: the dignity of work, no matter how small. That man had seen potential in a scrawny kid no one else did, and it had changed the course of Clint's life. Now, decades later, Clint carried that lesson with him. He'd built a career most could only dream of, but he'd never forgotten where he came from, or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping Kevin wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the chance he'd once been given. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person believing in you to change everything. Kevin hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the worn business card in his hands. The address printed on it seemed like a gateway to something he had long given up on: hope. He gave Clint a final nod before turning away, his footsteps slow and uncertain as he walked down the street. Clint watched him go, his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip of his coffee, then leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty seat across from him. Something about Kevin's story had struck a chord, pulling at memories Clint rarely let surface. He knew what it was like to struggle, maybe not in the same way Kevin did, but he understood what it meant to fight against the odds, to keep going even when the world seemed intent on knocking you down. Clint had spent his childhood navigating the hardships of the Great Depression, watching his family scrape by with whatever little they had. Those early years had shaped him, taught him resilience. And now, here he was, decades later, a man who had built a legacy, who had seen the highest peaks of success. Yet, in that brief exchange with Kevin, he was reminded of something simple but powerful: kindness still mattered. A single act of compassion could change the course of a life. Kevin's journey begins. That night, Kevin stood outside the shelter, the business card still clutched in his fingers. He had spent hours pacing the streets, debating whether to walk through those doors. He had tried shelters before, only to leave feeling more defeated than when he arrived. But something about Clint's words lingered in his mind. You need a chapter, a real one. With a deep breath, Kevin stepped inside. The shelter was bright, bustling with activity. Volunteers moved between guests, offering food, blankets, and quiet encouragement. A middle-aged man with kind eyes approached him. "First time here?" the man asked. Kevin nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his bones. "Come on, let's get you set up." For the first time in years, Kevin slept in a warm bed. It wasn't much, just a cot in a shared room, but it was better than the cold pavement. And in the morning, he woke up to something he hadn't had in a long time: an opportunity. The shelter's job placement program helped him land a temporary position at a warehouse. It was tough work, long hours unloading trucks and stacking boxes. But it was a start. Every day, as he dragged his tired body home, he thought about the conversation with Clint. Kevin didn't know if he'd ever get the chance to thank him, but he promised himself that if he ever got back on his feet, he would pay it forward. Months later, a letter finds its way to Clint. Sitting in his quiet home, Clint flipped through his mail: bills, invitations, a few fan letters. And then, an envelope with no return address caught his eye. He opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper. Clint, I don't know if you remember me, but I sure as hell remember you. I was the guy outside that cafe, asking for $1. Instead, you gave me something more valuable, a second chance. I don't know why you took the time to talk to me that day, but I want you to know that it made a difference. I went to that shelter, just like you told me to. They helped me get a job, a place to stay, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving forward. I used to think people like me were forgotten, but you saw me, and that meant everything. Thank you, Kevin. Clint sat back, rereading the letter, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with a handful of other letters and mementos from over the years. For Clint, it was never about recognition. It was about remembering where he came from, about passing on the kindness he had once received. And somewhere, in a small apartment he could finally call home, Kevin was writing the next chapter of his story, one he never thought possible: the power of a small gesture. The story of Clint Eastwood and Kevin is more than just a tale of kindness. It's a reminder that sometimes, the smallest gestures can lead to the greatest transformations. A simple conversation, a belief in someone when they've stopped believing in themselves, a reminder that no one is truly invisible. In a world where it's easy to look away, to ignore those who are struggling, this story reminds us that kindness doesn't just change the receiver, it changes the giver too. Because, at the end of the day, we all have a choice: to be the person who walks past, or the one who stops, listens, and offers a helping hand. The dollar that changed everything. As Kevin took a few hesitant steps away, he turned back one last time. Thanks for listening, he said awkwardly, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Take care of yourself, Kevin, he said simply before slipping his sunglasses back on and returning to his coffee. But Kevin didn't see Clint's hand falter slightly as he picked up the cup. He didn't notice the way Clint's jaw tightened for a brief moment, as if holding back a flood of emotion. Sitting alone again, Clint let out a slow breath, staring at the empty chair where Kevin had been just moments before. It wasn't the first time he'd been reminded of his past, but this time, it hit harder. He had been younger than Kevin when he first learned how quickly life could knock you down. Growing up during the Great Depression, Clint had watched his parents struggle to keep food on the table. There were nights when all they had was a can of beans to share between them. And then, there were the strangers, neighbors, churchgoers, sometimes complete nobodies, who had stepped in with small acts of kindness that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic who had offered Clint his first job, a chance to earn a few bucks cleaning tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it taught him something invaluable: the dignity of work, no matter how small. That man had seen potential in a scrawny kid that no one else did, and it had changed the course of Clint's life. Now, decades later, Clint carried that lesson with him. He had built a career that most people could only dream of, but he had never forgotten where he came from, or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping Kevin wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the same chance he had once been given. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Kevin, but he also knew that sometimes, all it took was one person believing in you to spark something bigger. Kevin's first step. Kevin walked aimlessly through the streets, the business card still clenched in his hand. He passed by shop windows, where his reflection stared back at him, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something new: hope. He stopped outside a laundromat, staring at the flickering neon sign. With the little money he had left, he decided to wash his clothes. If he was going to show up at that shelter Clint had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step. And that first step would be the hardest and most important one Kevin had taken in years. The shelter was overwhelming at first: the fluorescent lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, the steady buzz of voices. He felt out of place, like he didn't belong. But the staff was kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in. For the first time in years, Kevin felt like someone actually saw him, not as a problem, but as a person. Days turned into weeks, and though the road wasn't smooth, Kevin began piecing his life back together. The shelter helped him secure a temporary job at a nearby warehouse. He worked hard, showing up early, staying late, proving himself to be reliable and determined. With the money he earned, he moved into a modest shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head, a step toward stability. Through it all, he thought about Clint Eastwood. He kept the business card, now worn and creased, as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. A letter to Clint. One night, after a particularly long shift, Kevin sat down and wrote Clint a letter. Clint, I don't know if you remember me, but I sure as hell remember you. I was the guy outside that cafe, asking for $1. Instead, you gave me something more valuable, a second chance. I don't know why you took the time to talk to me that day, but I want you to know that it made a difference. I went to that shelter, just like you told me to. They helped me get a job, a place to stay, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm moving forward. I used to think people like me were forgotten, but you saw me, and that meant everything. Thank you, Kevin. Kevin didn't expect a response, but writing the letter felt like closure, a way to acknowledge the man who had given him a second chance. Clint's reaction. Months later, Clint sat in his quiet office, flipping through his mail, bills, invitations, a few fan letters. Then, an envelope with no return address caught his eye. He opened it, unfolding the letter, reading every word carefully. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Slowly, he folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer, where he kept other mementos from his life. For Clint, it was never about recognition. It was about paying forward the compassion he had been shown when he needed it most. The ripple effect. Kevin's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he started volunteering at the same shelter that had helped him. He spoke with others who were struggling, sharing his story and offering them the same encouragement Clint had given him. Slowly but surely, he became a symbol of resilience and hope within his community. A lesson in kindness and second chances. Life is unpredictable. One day, you may be on top of the world, and the next, you could find yourself struggling in ways you never imagined. But as Kevin's story shows, one moment of kindness can change everything. A simple conversation, a gesture of understanding, or a chance given at the right time can spark transformation. We never truly know the battles others are fighting, and sometimes, all they need is someone to see them, not as a problem, but as a person. So be that person. Extend kindness, listen, and never underestimate the power of a second chance.